No one told me they weren't coming. There was no call, no message, no excuse waiting for me at the door. I stood there in a rented suit that still smelled like plastic, watching empty chairs arranged in perfect rows, each one holding a name I had memorized since childhood. My mother's seat, my father's, my brother's, all untouched. The officiant kept checking his watch. The photographer avoided my eyes. Someone whispered that flights had been delayed. Another said maybe there was an emergency, but I already knew. Because 3 days earlier, my sister had posted photos, smiling, surrounded by all of them 15 states away. And in every picture, they looked relaxed, like they hadn't left anything important behind. I have always been the kind of person people describe in simple terms. Quiet, reliable, easy to manage, not invisible, just unchallenging. In my family, that mattered more than I realized at the time. My sister filled space without trying. Conversations shifted toward her, even when she wasn't speaking. Plans adjusted around her preferences, her timing, her moods. It was never announced. It just happened, consistently enough that no one questioned it. I learned early that things moved more smoothly when I didn't compete with that. So I didn't. I showed up where I was expected. I stayed longer than I needed to. I remembered birthdays without reminders, called when it felt appropriate, listened when conversations circled back to the same stories I had already heard. It wasn't an effort. It became a pattern. And patterns over time feel like stability. There were no obvious problems between us, no arguments that lingered, no moments I could point to and say something had broken. If anything, we functioned well, predictable, calm, intact on the surface. That was enough for me. When I met the person I decided to marry, nothing about my approach changed. I didn't make an announcement expecting attention. I didn't frame it as something that would shift the family dynamic. I told them the same way I told them everything else, directly, without performance. I'm getting married. There was a pause, not long, just enough to register. Then my mother asked when. My father nodded, as if confirming something he had already assumed would happen eventually. My sister smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes in a way I could fully interpret. Still, no resistance, no concern, just acceptance. I took that as support. We discussed dates over a few conversations, nothing formal. I mentioned a venue I had already secured, small, practical, within my means. No one objected. My mother asked if there would be enough seating. My father said travel wouldn't be an issue if we planned ahead. My sister said, "Just tell me when to be there. I'll come early if you need help." It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was clear. And clarity for me was enough. I didn't need excitement. I needed consistency. Planning the wedding followed the same logic I had always used in my life. I kept things simple, manageable. I chose vendors who responded on time, kept records of payments, confirmed details in writing. I sent out the invitations myself. Not digitally, not casually, printed, addressed, tracked. Each one included the same information: date, time, location, no ambiguity. I remember placing my parents' envelope on the table for a moment before sealing it. It felt unnecessary to send something so formal to people who already knew, but I did it anyway, because systems matter. A few days later, my mother mentioned receiving it. She laughed lightly, said it felt official now. My father asked about parking at the venue. My sister texted, "Got it, looks nice." That was the extent of it. No follow-up questions, no detailed discussions. But again, I didn't expect them. In my experience, people didn't always express commitment in words. Sometimes it showed up in presence, in showing up on the day at the time without needing to confirm every step along the way. That had always been our pattern, and I trusted patterns more than promises. As the date approached, I continued making arrangements. Confirmations were sent. Deposits were finalized. The officiant checked in twice to ensure everything was aligned. Everything moved forward exactly as it should. And every time I thought about my family being there, I didn't imagine a moment. I imagined a certainty. My mother sitting near the front, adjusting something small in her hands. My father standing slightly apart, observing more than engaging. My sister arriving a little early, maybe offering help in a way that felt optional but present. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just there. That was all I had ever needed from them. Presence without complication. I never called to confirm flights, never asked for arrival times. It didn't feel necessary. Because in every version of my life up until that point, they had always been there when it counted. Not perfectly, not loudly, but consistently enough that I never had to question it, and I didn't question it now. The first change was small enough to ignore, a delay in response. I sent a message to our family group chat about finalizing the schedule. Nothing complicated, just a reminder of the ceremony time and when guests would begin arriving. It was the kind of message that usually got a quick acknowledgement. This time it sat there, read but unanswered. An hour passed. Then two. By the end of the day, only my father had responded, and even that was brief. Got it! No questions, no follow-up. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People get busy. Conversations get lost. Still, I noticed it. A few days later, I called my mother to go over a couple of details. She answered on the third ring, her voice slightly distracted, like she had been in the middle of something else. I asked if she had made any travel arrangements yet. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel like she was searching for the right answer rather than recalling something already decided. "We're working on it," she said. "There's still time." There was still time. That was true. But it wasn't how she usually spoke about plans. My mother preferred things settled early, confirmed, organized in a way that left no room for last-minute stress. I let it pass. We moved on to other topics. She asked about the venue again, even though we had already discussed it twice before. I repeated the same details. She listened, then shifted the conversation toward something unrelated, a neighbor, a small family update, something that didn't require focus. When the call ended, I sat with the silence for a moment longer than usual. Not concern, just a slight imbalance. I adjusted to it the way I always did, by giving it less weight. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Messages took longer to receive responses. When they did come, they were shorter, less specific. I sent a follow-up about seating arrangements, asking if anyone had preferences or needed accommodations. My sister replied hours later. "Whatever works." That was all. No questions about who would be there. No mention of arriving early like she had said before. I reread the message once, then put my phone down. Again, I told myself it wasn't unusual. She had always been like that, informal, non-committal until the last moment. But even then, there had always been an underlying assumption that she would follow through. Now, that assumption felt thinner, not broken, just less solid than it had been. A few days later, I tried calling her. It went to voicemail. She texted back an hour later. "Busy, what's up?" I considered writing out my question, something simple about timing, about when she planned to arrive, but I stopped. Instead, I replied, "Nothing urgent, just checking in." She didn't respond after that. The conversation ended without actually happening. I began to notice how often that was happening. Conversations that started but didn't complete. Questions that were acknowledged but not answered. Not directly avoided, just redirected into nothing. Even my father, who usually kept things straightforward, had started doing the same. When I asked him if he needed help booking flights, he said, "I'll take care of it." There was no follow-up, no confirmation later that it had been done. Normally, I would have asked again, clarified, closed the loop. This time, I didn't. I wasn't sure why. Part of it was habit. I wasn't used to pressing people for details. But part of it was something else, something harder to define. A sense that pushing for answers might shift the tone in a way I didn't want. Like asking directly would expose something that was still, at this point, only a feeling. So I adjusted again. I focused on what I could control. The venue confirmed final numbers. The caterer requested a head count. I provided estimates based on what I knew, filling in the gaps with assumptions that still felt reasonable at the time. Of course they would be there. There was no reason to think otherwise. And yet, underneath that certainty, something quieter had started to form. Not doubt, not yet, just a subtle sense of displacement. Like I was organizing something important, and the people I expected to stand inside it with me were slowly stepping just outside its edges. Not leaving completely. Just far enough that I could feel the distance, but not enough to explain it. The first time it felt deliberate, I didn't react. I just noticed it, and then I stayed quiet long enough to understand it wasn't accidental. It happened during a call with my father. I had asked a simple question, what day he planned to arrive. Not even a request for details, just a general sense of timing so I could coordinate transportation from the airport. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "We'll figure that out." Not "I'll be there Friday." Not "I'm booking tonight." Just, "We'll figure that out." I waited for him to continue. He didn't. The conversation moved on without resolving it. He asked about the weather. I answered. He mentioned something about work. I listened. When the call ended, I didn't feel confused. I felt something closer to recognition. Not of what was happening, but of what was. There was no commitment in his voice. No intention to follow through with specifics. It was the absence of something I had always taken for granted. I started paying closer attention after that. Not actively questioning, just observing with more precision. A few days later, I was reviewing final confirmations from vendors when I realized I still didn't have arrival details from anyone in my family. No flight numbers, no estimated times, nothing I could work with. I opened our message thread and scrolled back. Every time I had asked a direct question, the response had been partial or delayed. Sometimes both. I read through each exchange carefully, not looking for meaning, just for structure. There was a pattern. Questions about the wedding were answered vaguely. Questions unrelated to it received clearer responses. It wasn't that they weren't communicating. It was that they were choosing where to be specific. That distinction mattered. I didn't confront it. Instead, I made a smaller adjustment. I sent a message that required a clear answer. "Can you confirm what day you're arriving? I need to finalize transport." I kept the tone neutral, practical. The message was read within minutes. No response. Hours passed, then a full day. When my sister finally replied, it wasn't an answer. "Why are you stressing about this? It'll be fine." I read it twice. There was no acknowledgement of the question itself, just a shift in tone from logistics to emotion. I responded simply, "I just need the timing." She didn't reply again. That was the moment something settled into place, not fully formed, but no longer abstract. This wasn't disorganization. It was avoidance. Intentional, consistent, and shared. I didn't need to prove it. I could see it in the structure of every interaction. A few days after that, the first piece of information surfaced by accident. I wasn't looking for it. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it casually during a conversation that had nothing to do with the wedding. "She's excited about the trip," he said. I didn't ask which trip. I let him continue. "Said it's been planned for a while. Whole family going, right?" I didn't respond immediately. He noticed the pause. "Oh, maybe I shouldn't have said anything." I shook my head slightly, more out of habit than reassurance. "It's fine," I said. But it was. Not because of the trip itself, because of the timing. I didn't ask for details from him. I didn't need to. I already had enough to place it within the calendar I had been managing so carefully. There was only one window where the whole family, being away, would conflict with something that involved all of them being present. My wedding. Still, I didn't assume. Assumptions leave room for error, so I verified quietly. Flight routes, travel durations, event schedules, nothing invasive, just publicly available information arranged in a way that made sense. The more I aligned the details, the less room there was for coincidence. The trip overlapped exactly, not partially, completely. And yet, no one had mentioned it to me. Not once. I didn't confront them, not yet, because by then I understood something important. If they had wanted me to know, I would have known already. And if they hadn't told me, then whatever explanation they might offer now wouldn't be the truth. I didn't confront them immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand how far the silence would go if I didn't interrupt it. For a few days, I said nothing about the trip. I continued as if everything was still aligned. I sent 1 or 2 final logistical updates, kept my tone consistent, gave them space to correct it themselves. They didn't, so I asked, not directly, not in a way that forced an admission. I called my mother and kept my voice even. I heard there might be a trip planned, I said, around the same time. There was a pause, longer this time. Then she laughed lightly, the way people do when they want something to sound smaller than it is. Oh, that. It's nothing serious, just something your sister has been talking about. Is it scheduled? I asked. It's flexible, she said. We're still figuring things out. The phrasing was familiar. Vague, open-ended, designed to avoid confirmation. I didn't push. I let the conversation continue, allowed her to move on to other topics the same way she had before. But this time, I wasn't filling in the gaps with trust. I was noticing how carefully they were being left open. Later that evening, I called my sister. She didn't answer. She sent a message instead. Can't talk, what's up? I stared at the screen for a moment before typing. Just wanted to confirm your plans for the wedding. Her response came quickly. I already told you I'll be there. There was no acknowledgement of the trip, no hesitation, just a direct contradiction of what I already knew. I read it again, not for meaning, but for tone. It was firm, not defensive, not apologetic, certain. That certainty didn't match the facts. I replied, okay. Nothing else. The next day my father called. It was unusual. He rarely initiated calls without a specific reason. His voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. Your mother said you've been asking questions, he said. I just asked about timing, I replied. You're overcomplicating things, he said. Everyone knows where they need to be. The statement was absolute, but it wasn't true. No one had confirmed anything. No one had provided details. And now, instead of answering, he was reframing the issue. I didn't argue. I just need to finalize arrangements, I said. You worry too much, he replied. Focus on the wedding, not the logistics. The conversation ended shortly after that. No answers, just a subtle shift in responsibility, as if the lack of clarity was something I had created. Over the next few days, the pattern intensified. Every attempt at clarification was met with the same responses. You're overthinking. You're stressing yourself out. It'll all work out. The words changed slightly, but the structure remained the same. Deflection, reassurance, no information. I started to notice something else as well, how quickly they aligned with each other. If I asked my mother, she would reference something my sister had said. If I spoke to my sister, she would mention that my father had already handled it. Each response pointed to someone else, creating a loop with no origin. There was no single answer, only a system of answers that avoided resolution. I stopped asking after that, not because I believed them, but because I understood the function of their responses. They weren't meant to inform me. They were meant to manage me, to keep me calm, to keep me from pressing further, to maintain a version of reality where everything was still intact. And for a brief moment, I considered accepting it, not because it made sense, but because it was easier. Easier to believe that things would somehow align at the last moment. easier to trust the pattern I had relied on for years. But the difference now was that I had already seen the contradiction. Once you see it, you can't return to not seeing it. So I adjusted again. I stopped asking questions. I stopped expecting answers. And instead, I started paying attention to what was actually happening, not what they said would happen. Because by then, it was clear. The truth wasn't being hidden by silence alone. It was being replaced carefully, consistently, with something easier to accept. The first confirmation didn't come from them. It came from someone who had no reason to hide it. A distant relative called me a week before the wedding. The conversation started normally, asking about final preparations, whether everything was in place. His tone was casual, unaware of anything unusual. Then, in the middle of a sentence, he said something that didn't belong. "Your sister must be excited." That kind of trip doesn't happen often. I didn't interrupt him. I let him continue. 15 states is a long way to go for a celebration, he added. But I guess when the whole family's going, it makes sense. There was no hesitation in his voice, no awareness that what he was saying hadn't already been shared with me. I kept my response neutral. "Yeah," I said, "it's a big trip." He moved on without noticing anything. The conversation ended a few minutes later, still calm, still ordinary. But the structure had changed. What had been fragments before, vague mentions, indirect hints, was now a complete outline. Trip, distance, whole family, no uncertainty. I didn't call anyone after that. I didn't ask for clarification, because at that point, clarification wasn't necessary. Verification was. I opened my laptop and started organizing what I already had. Dates, messages, responses. I placed each piece in order, not emotionally, but logically. My wedding date sat at the center. Fixed, non-negotiable. Then I aligned the information about the trip around it. Public posts, tagged locations, small details that people rarely think to hide completely. It didn't take long. The overlap wasn't partial. It was exact. Same days, same time frame. There was no version of events where both things could happen without conflict. And yet they had told me directly, repeatedly, that they would be there. That was the part that settled the truth fully, not the trip itself. The contradiction. I leaned back in my chair and sat there for a while without moving. There was no surge of anger, no immediate reaction, just a quiet recognition of something final. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't been disorganized. They had made a decision early enough to plan travel across multiple states and then maintained a separate narrative with me. Not once breaking it, not once adjusting it, even when asked directly, even when given multiple opportunities to correct it. That level of consistency required coordination, which meant it wasn't one person, it was all of them. I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I waited. Not passively, but deliberately. I wanted to see if the truth would surface on its own once the timeline tightened. Once it became impossible to maintain both versions without conflict. A few days later, a photo appeared. It was posted briefly, then removed. But I had already seen it. My sister standing in what looked like an airport terminal, smiling. Behind her, partially out of frame, my mother, my father, all of them together. The timestamp placed it exactly where it needed to be. The day before my wedding. I didn't take a screenshot. I didn't need to. The image wasn't evidence. It was confirmation of what I had already constructed. Later that evening, my sister sent a message. "Everything good on your end?" I looked at the words for a long time. There was no reference to the trip, no acknowledgement of the conflict, just a neutral check-in as if nothing had shifted. I typed a response slowly. "Yes, everything is set." That was all, because it was true. Everything was set. The venue was confirmed. The officiant was ready. The schedule was locked. And now, so was the truth. They had chosen where to be. They had chosen what to say. And they had chosen not to tell me. I didn't ask them to explain it. I didn't ask them to justify it, because by then I understood something more important than the reason. The reason didn't change the outcome, and the outcome was already in place. They wouldn't be there, not because they couldn't, but because they had decided together that something else mattered more. After that, I stopped initiating contact, not as a statement, not as a reaction, just as a correction. There was nothing left to confirm and nothing left to clarify. The structure of everything had already been established. If they wanted to say something, they would. They didn't. The days leading up to the wedding became quieter. Not externally, there were still calls with vendors, final confirmations, small logistical adjustments, but internally something had settled into place. I moved through each task with precision: final headcount, seating arrangement, payment confirmations, each step documented, each interaction recorded, not because I expected a problem, but because it was the only part of the process still fully within my control. Every now and then, a message would come through. My mother asked if I needed anything. My sister sent a short, "Hope everything's going smoothly." My father didn't message at all. None of them mentioned travel. None of them acknowledged where they were. And I didn't ask. The absence of information had become information. The day before the wedding, I woke up earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. There were still a few things to finalize at the venue, and I preferred handling them myself rather than delegating. When I arrived, the space was exactly as expected. Chairs arranged in clean rows. Decorations minimal, intentional, nothing excessive. The coordinator walked me through the setup one last time. I listened, nodded, confirmed details. Everything aligned. At one point, she asked about my family. "Will they be arriving later today or tomorrow morning?" The question was routine, neutral. I answered without hesitation. "Tomorrow." It wasn't true, but it was consistent with everything that had been set up until that point, and I wasn't ready to correct it yet. Later that afternoon, I checked my phone. There were new photos, not sent to me, posted publicly. My sister again. This time at what looked like an outdoor venue. String lights. Tables arranged for an event. People moving in the background. My mother was in one of the frames, speaking to someone just out of view. My father stood further back, hands in his pockets, watching something unfold. They looked settled, not in transit, not preparing to leave, already there. I scrolled through the images once, then closed the app. There was no need to analyze them further. They had arrived, just not where they said they would be. That evening, the officiant called to confirm the timing for the next day. We went over the schedule again: ceremony start, duration, closing. Everything remained unchanged. At the end of the call, he asked if there were any last-minute considerations. "Family arriving on time?" Another neutral question. I paused for a moment. Then I said, "Yes." The word felt different this time, not uncertain, deliberate. Because by then I understood something clearly. Their absence was not a disruption to the system I had built. It was simply a variable that no longer needed to be accounted for. The next morning, I got ready alone. There were no calls, no messages waiting when I woke up, no indication that anything was about to change. I dressed slowly, adjusting each detail without rushing. The suit fit the way it was supposed to. The room was quiet. At one point, I checked my phone again. There was a message from my sister. "Big day, don't stress." Nothing else. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a statement that existed independently of reality. I didn't reply. When I arrived at the venue, guests had already started to gather. Not many, just enough to fill the space without making it feel empty. I greeted them, thanked them for coming, moved through the room the way I had planned. Everything continued. At some point, the coordinator approached me quietly. "We're about 10 minutes from starting," she said. "Do you want to wait for anyone?" The question was simple. It required a decision. I looked at the rows of chairs. The ones reserved for my family were still empty, names placed neatly on each seat, unclaimed. I checked my phone one last time. No missed calls, no messages, no indication that they were on their way. I put the phone back in my pocket. "No," I said. My voice didn't change. There was no hesitation. Because the decision had already been made, just not by me. The ceremony lasted exactly as long as it was scheduled to. No delays, no interruptions. Everything moved forward with the same quiet precision I had built into it from the beginning. The officiant spoke clearly. The words were measured, practiced. I listened, responded when expected, followed each step without deviation. There was no moment where I looked toward the empty chairs again. I had already seen them. Seeing them twice wouldn't change anything. When it ended, people approached in small groups. They offered congratulations, shook my hand, spoke in careful tones that balanced sincerity with an awareness of something unspoken. No one mentioned my family directly, but I could see it in the way their eyes moved, briefly, instinctively, toward the empty seats before returning to me. Witnesses don't need explanations. They construct their own understanding from what is visible, and what was visible was enough. The reception followed. Conversations, quiet movement, small moments of normalcy arranged over something that wasn't normal at all. I moved through it the same way I had moved through everything else. Present, composed, unaffected, at least on the surface. At one point, someone asked where my parents were. The question wasn't confrontational, just practical. I answered the same way I had answered before. "They couldn't make it." No elaboration. The person nodded, accepted it, moved on. The simplicity of that exchange stayed with me, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't required. No one needed the full explanation. The absence spoke for itself. By the time the event ended, there was nothing left to manage. The systems had done their job. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Everything that couldn't be had already happened. That night, I returned home and sat in the quiet for a long time. The suit was still on. The room was still arranged the same way I had left it that morning. Nothing had changed externally, but internally something had reached its final point. Not a breaking in the sense of collapse, a breaking in the sense of clarity. I took my phone out and opened the messages again. My sister's last text, my mother's earlier check-in, the absence of anything from my father. Then I opened the photos I had seen, not to revisit them emotionally, but to confirm the structure one last time. Dates, locations, timing, everything aligned exactly as it had before. There were no gaps left, no uncertainty, just a complete, consistent record of what had happened. I realized then that there was nothing left to ask them. No question that would produce an answer I didn't already have. No explanation that would change the outcome. And more importantly, no response from them that would be fully honest. Because honesty would require acknowledging something they had all participated in. Something coordinated. Something deliberate. People don't admit to that easily. They reframe it, minimize it, shift it into something less defined. I had already seen that process begin, so I made a decision, not in anger, not in reaction. In recognition, I would not confront them. I would not ask for an apology. I would not explain how it affected me, because all of those actions assume that the other side is willing to engage with the truth, and they had already shown that they weren't. Instead, I focused on what was actually within my control. Access. Not emotional access, structural access. Who gets information, who is included, who is relied on. Those decisions didn't require their participation. They only required mine. I went through my contacts and made small adjustments, not dramatic, not visible from the outside. Just changes in how information would flow moving forward. Fewer updates, fewer invitations, less access to anything that required trust. I didn't block anyone. I didn't send a message explaining the change. There was no announcement, because announcements create opportunities for negotiation. And this wasn't a negotiation. It was an adjustment to reality. They had made their decision clearly, collectively, without including me. Now I was making mine, just as quietly, just as completely. The first message came 2 days later, not from my parents, from my sister. "Hey, just checking in. How did everything go?" I read it once, then set the phone down. There was no urgency in her words, no indication that anything unusual had happened, just a casual question asked as if the answer existed independently of her absence. I didn't respond immediately, not to delay, just because there was nothing to clarify. Everything had gone exactly as it was always going to go. A few hours later, another message appeared. "Sorry we couldn't make it. Timing got complicated." That was the first acknowledgement. Brief. Contained, it didn't reference the trip, didn't explain the decision, just reduced it to a logistical issue, something abstract, something external. I replied with a single sentence. It was already clear. No accusation, no emotion, just a statement. She didn't respond after that. Later that evening, my mother called. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was softer than usual, careful in a way I recognized. "We've been meaning to talk to you," she said. I didn't interrupt. "There were a lot of moving parts," she continued. "Your sister had something important planned and everything just overlapped. We thought we could manage both, but—" She let the sentence trail off. There was space there for me to ask, to react, to fill in what she hadn't said. I didn't, because what she was offering wasn't an explanation. It was a version, one that removed the element of choice. I responded evenly. "You made a decision." There was a pause on the other end. "That's not fair," she said quietly. The words were familiar, not because they were accurate, but because they shifted the focus. From what happened to how I was interpreting it, I didn't adjust my tone. "It doesn't need to be fair," I said. "It just needs to be true." She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she moved back into softer language, regret phrased without specificity. "We wish we could have been there." I let the silence sit for a moment before answering. "You could have been." The line went quiet, not disconnected, just still. There was nothing else to add. Eventually, she ended the call with something neutral. "We'll talk soon." I didn't agree or disagree. After that, the messages became less frequent, not because they stopped reaching out, but because the structure had changed. They would send something, an update, a question, an attempt to return to normal conversation. I would respond, but only to what was necessary. No extensions, no continuation. Just contained, functional exchanges. Over time, the difference became noticeable. Invitations that would have been automatic before were no longer extended. Information that would have been shared casually was now withheld. Not as a reaction, as a standard. I noticed the shift in their tone before they addressed it directly. Messages became more careful, more deliberate. Then, eventually, the question came. From my father this time. A short message. "You've been distant. Everything okay?" I read it without reacting. There was a simplicity to it that almost worked if the context didn't exist. I replied with the same structure I had used before. "Everything is consistent." He didn't respond. A few days later, I heard from someone outside the immediate situation. Another relative. They mentioned the trip, the scale of it, the effort it took to coordinate. "Must have been important," they said. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. Because by then, the information had already started moving on its own. Not through confrontation, through visibility. Photos, timelines, small details that didn't align with the explanation my family had offered. No one needed to expose it directly. It exposed itself. And in that exposure, something shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but enough. Enough for the narrative they had maintained to stop holding. Regret, when it appeared, was subtle. A change in tone. A hesitation before speaking. but it never fully formed into accountability. And by that point, it didn't matter because the structure had already changed, permanently. The photos came back a week later, edited, structured, complete. I went through them once slowly. Everything was there, the ceremony, the reception, the small details I had arranged carefully. The lighting was even. The composition was balanced. Nothing looked incomplete. If someone didn't know what was missing, they wouldn't see it. The empty chairs weren't framed. They existed just outside the edges of most shots, implied more than shown. Only one image captured them directly. A wide angle taken before the ceremony began. Rows aligned, names placed neatly on each seat. Unoccupied, I didn't delete it. I didn't move it either. I left it where it was, part of the sequence. Accurate. Life after that didn't change dramatically. There was no visible break, no final conversation that marked a clear end, just an adjustment that continued quietly. Contact with my family became functional, occasional messages, short calls, nothing extended beyond what was necessary. They didn't push for more, not directly, but I could hear it in the pauses, in the way conversations hesitated before ending as if something was expected but not requested. I didn't fill those gaps anymore. The structure held. Over time, the distance stopped feeling like something new. It became the default, stable in its own way. I stopped revisiting the wedding, except when something required it. Documents, records, formalities. It existed as a completed event. Not defined by what happened, but by what didn't. Sometimes I think about the moment the decision was made. Not mine, theirs. The point where they chose one place over another, one event over another, one version of truth over another. I don't try to understand it. Understanding doesn't change structure. And structure is what remains. They made a choice. I saw it clearly. And I adjusted everything that came after without needing to say it out loud.